Hello and welcome to Creative Feedback as a tool for arts education leadership. We are so glad that you are here. Um, so firstly, we would love to just let you know that this morning's session is one in a series of learning sessions that's developed and designed by Ingenuity's Learning and Development Provider Program residents. That's all of our folks right here on this slide. The program is called Constellation because the residents have come together over the last several months to ideate, knowledge share, and workshop their respective learning sessions so they can elevate key areas of their expertise, research, and experience as arts partners and arts educators and share it back with you all, in essence, creating a partner-to-partner learning network. So we want to thank all of the residents for this incredible collaboration and thoughtful work, which will continue to be presented throughout the spring and into the summer. Today's session, which is developed by Liz Rice, will invite us to cultivate the skills of giving and receiving feedback in all levels of arts education leadership. So I'm very excited. My name is Ariel Frost. I'm the manager of partnerships and learning here at Ingenuity. And we are joined here today by Liz Rice, our Constellation resident, who's the manager of curriculum and education at Second Story, and being co-facilitated with Amanda Delheimer, who's the artistic director of Second Story. And then just a few little housekeeping notes. If you haven't already, we invite you to update your name with your pronouns and your organization's name. And you can do that by hovering over your image icon and selecting the three dots. Note that we will be recording today's session, and additionally, handouts and slides of this session will be available following the session. And then closed captioning is also available, and you can enable captions by adjusting the subtitle settings in the More section at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I would love to hand it over to Liz and Amanda.
Awesome. Thanks, Ariel. We're so excited to be with you today. As Ariel is saying, this is Creative Feedback as a tool for arts education leadership. My name is Liz Rice. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the manager of curriculum and education at Second Story. If you're looking for me on your screen, I am a white presenting woman with short brown hair, or because it's tied back, wearing a blue top in front of a black background with a little Second Story logo on it. I'm going to pass it over to my co-facilitator to introduce herself as well.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Delheimer. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Second Story's artistic director. If you're looking for me, I also have my hair pulled back in a bun. I'm a white woman with red glasses, wearing hoop earrings, which are disappearing into my blurred background. But that is all right. Back to you, Liz.
Yeah. So we are Second Story. We're a personal narrative storytelling organization located in the Albany Park neighborhood of Chicago. We believe that stories are what bind us to one another, so we create spaces like this one where we can share and listen to each other's true and personal stories in the hopes that it can create change in those who listen to them. So what we're doing today really is this idea of giving and receiving feedback is a skill unto itself, right? So as managers and leaders and educators, we're going to look at how we can provide critique to our artists, employees, and students that is meaningful and empathetic and inspires us to grow and train and change rather than feel shame and defeat. So we're going to do a little bit of introductions as we've already started and some space setting. We're going to head into a warm up where we'll ask you to think about your own experiences and share some stories. We're going to look at the critical response process in an artistic manner. And then we will take a break before applying it to how we can use CRP in the workplace. Finally, we'll practice what we learn in some scenarios and have a little discussion before we close out for the day. I hope that sounds good to y'all. Will be a very interactive workshop. So I invite you, if you can, to turn on your screens and join us as well. Before we begin, though, I do want to offer an acknowledgement of where we are at the moment. One of Second Story's core values is inclusion, and as part of our practice, we strive to be thoughtful about the time and space in which we operate. So I want to acknowledge that we're living and working in a country that grew out of stolen land and stolen labor with a system that thrives on exploitation. We continue to exist in a world that is full of tragedy, and we're witnessing it in real time. The work that we all do in the nonprofit art sector push against these systems of exploitation and offer opportunities to those who have been affected by violence and the lack of resources to really share their experiences. Another way that we push against these systems is to offer care to each other is by sharing stories. So we thank you for engaging in this sacred practice today with us. So the other thing that I want to do is we bring a set of group agreements to any space that we work in with Second Story. So the first group agreement I'd love to share with our group today is what's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. As you entered the workshop, you would notice that it's being recorded and will be made accessible to other arts educators. However, I want to let you know that only the main room will be recorded. Breakout sessions are not recorded as part of the Zoom. In addition, that this first group agreement is also one about privacy, right? We are sharing our own stories, our own experiences. If Amanda shares a story with me, it doesn't give me the right to go out into the world and share like, oh, I heard this story by Amanda today. But if what she shares with me really makes me think about how I see the world, about my own life, I want to share that learning out with everybody else. Our second group agreement is practice equity by sharing the floor. And Amanda, I don't see them coming up on the screen. Yes, awesome. Practice equity by sharing the floor. And this is really about making sure that as many voices can be heard in our work today as possible. And then the third group agreement is take care of yourself. Right. Sometimes we're not ready to tell every single story from our experience. So we invite you to take care of yourself. We are artists and arts administrators, not therapists. So please don't take yourself to a place that we can't help you back from. These are the ones that we bring, but we always ask if anybody wants to add any additions to this list. Either feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand and come off mic. Right. It seems like this feels good for people. This feels good for people. So I think if you agree, I'll invite you to either write it in the chat, I agree, or you can use your emojis or I always want to say remotions, but that's not the reactions. And I see I agree is coming in the chat. I will also say that I will agree to follow these as well. All right. Thank you all. Well, let's get started with a quick warm-up. So as I mentioned, Second Story is a personal narrative storytelling company. So our artistic work is telling true stories from our experiences. So we wanted to start by sharing some stories around feedback. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to invite people to drop their number in the chat. 1 being I hate it and 10 being I love it. How comfortable are you with receiving feedback? So if you just want to go ahead and drop your number into the chat on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable do you feel receiving feedback? And I'm going to try and open up this chat so I can see more of those numbers. Ooh. We got a lot of high numbers. I see like 6 and above in the chat as well. That is awesome. Then we're a good group to be doing this work with. So I am curious, and I'll also invite you to drop this in the chat. I was like, what does that feel like in your body when someone has thoughts or feedback for you? Just by dropping a word, how does that feel in your body of what it feels like to receive that feedback? I'm seeing apprehensive, nervous, vulnerable, sometimes good, sometimes daunting. It's all in the shoulders. Ready? Huh. Depends on the feedback. I hear you, Raymira. Your stomach activates. And I'm super interested in the way that everybody who answered really was on the like 5 to 10, more towards I love it. But the way that it feels in our body like tends to be a little bit more, not negative, but maybe more nervous. We saw words like nervous, vulnerable, scary. It can be really visceral, that experience in the body. All right, I'm going to ask you to wipe that away and then think about, we'll do another scale. This time, I want you to think about on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable you are giving feedback. So 1 being I hate it and 10 being I love it. And drop that number into the chat. Ooh, I'm seeing a larger array of numbers this time. So we got some 3s and 4s, a lot of 7s, some 10s. Ooh, Alex, I get this. 10 if it's positive, 2 if it's negative. So in the same vein, I want you to do, just think about it again, about how does that feel like in your body when you have to critique somebody else, right? How do you feel in your body? We're seeing words like frozen, tentative, meh. All right, tense, supportive, cold sweat. I'm glad, Molly, that you put supportive. I think this is one of the first like positive words, open. Awesome, Demi. Will they receive it correctly? Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of like internal dialogue, but also it's interesting how some of the ways that our bodies feel when we're receiving feedback are also similar to the ways that our bodies feel when we are giving feedback. How much is too much? Sometimes apprehensive. All right. And now we're going to get really into the story aspect of this. So I'd love for you, if you have a piece of paper or you can just do it in your brain, to think of a moment when you felt really cared for at work, right? And potentially this is while you were learning something new. So take a second for yourself and take some notes about what happened, right, in that moment. Who else was there? Right? Do you remember where it happened? Like what were the actions leading up to it? And then I'm going to invite you in the same way of really thinking, using your body as a way to remember things. What did it feel like to be cared? What did it feel like to be cared for in that way? What did it feel like in your body? Right? Are you feeling the same sort of vulnerability and apprehension? And then what did it feel like in your heart? So I'm going to give you a second to jot a few notes down. And then once you have that story for yourself, I'm going to invite you to come off mic or drop into the chat, whichever you're more comfortable with. But like, what came up for you? What are some of those aspects of care that we can think about when we're centering this idea of giving feedback? So for me, as an example, like when I feel cared for at work, there's always this sense of relief in my body, right? And so when I'm getting feedback, when I feel relieved, I know that I'm feeling cared for at work. And I'm curious what came up for other folks as well.
This is a fairly recent thing, so I just wanted to say that I just felt seen and heard and just honored in that way as a person, just as a person, not as an employee, but just as a person.
Thanks, Demi. I don't know if everybody heard that but on my computer, I heard that you've felt seen and honored. Is that correct? Awesome. Yeah, what else? I'm also paying attention to the chat as well.
I can go. Whenever I receive feedback where I feel like I'm being taken care of at work, it reminds me of my own humanity. It reminds me of the humanity of my coworkers. So there's this like sense of empathy that just helps my shoulders kind of relax.
Both in the physical and in the heart.
Mhm.
I'm reading in the notes. I always feel loved and safe. And shout out to Courtney when I received feedback from Courtney. And then empathy is essential to care, right? Someone is sharing that they've had similar experiences or asked similar questions has made me feel cared for, right? So seeing what Carlo you were saying, like seeing the humanity in each other, and that's really what we are talking about today. Really, is how do we bring the humanity back into this process that can sometimes feel very daunting, very vulnerable to us, not just as artists, but even as like professional workers as well. Thank you all for sharing. There's going to be more moments for that, but I'm going to kick it over to Amanda to get us started with the critical response process.
Great. So like Liz said when she walked us through the plan for the day, we're going to do this twice, essentially. The first time we're going to use the critical response process as it was created, so as a feedback process looking at a piece of art. And then we're going to go back through it and talk about those different components and apply them to the workplace. I want to talk really shortly just about what this is. So Liz Lerman, if anybody's familiar with her work, she's a dance maker, choreographer. Her kind of real excitement is around creating dance pieces with non-traditional dancers. So like one of the pieces that I saw of hers was around kind of the experience of veterans post-war. And so there were a couple of dancers, but there were also a couple of folks who had lost limbs as a part of their service and that sort of stuff. And so like that is a big thing of her work. And so as she was trying to create these pieces and getting feedback from her audience, she found that frequently in those feedback sessions, and many of us have probably sat in this space where like you get something from an audience member that is either really hurtful or really you're not ready for that piece of feedback, or is this like opinion that comes at you like a javelin. So she created this process that really is very artist-centered and really tries to kind of create a space where we can approach the piece in the place where it is at and offer insight to the artist that they are really looking for and able to act on. So we're going to do a little model. Liz is working on a piece right now that she's going to perform for Second Story in February. Maybe you want to come to the show. So she's got a work in progress that she's going to share right now. And then we as a group are going to engage in the critical response process. And then we'll reflect a little bit on that. So Liz, I'm going to invite you to share your work in progress. You ready? It's a little excerpt of it, it's a little tiny morsel of the story that she'll be telling in February.
I'm 5 years old and standing in a church basement, participating in my first ever Chinese school speech competition. I've been practicing this speech for weeks. I say the intro. 各位来宾，各位评审，大家好，我叫米一芬，今年5岁。今天我要讲的题目是人与人之间的关系。I say my name, my age, my favorite things, all in Mandarin. The vinyl room dividers have been pushed back to open up the basement into one giant room. Heavy metal folding chairs have been set up in rows of 10 facing a blank wall where someone has set up a microphone. Today, we don't have our usual class schedule. Instead, we meet up with our class grades before filing downstairs for the annual speech competition. The winners of each grade will then go on to represent West Suburban Chinese School. our Chinese school, in the regional competition. As the adults and older students file into cold metal seats, the younger students take their places on the floor in front of the staging area. Our principal gives the standard greeting and welcome before launching into an introduction of my first grade class. One by one, we are each called up to present our speech. We give the same standard greeting, welcome, name, age, and topic. And soon, it's my turn. I've been practicing.
All right. So the first thing we're going to do for Liz is we're going to offer statements of meaning. So the opportunity here is to reflect back to the artist things that just held meaning in the offering that they just made. So I'll invite you to be specific. I'll say that there's like nothing too small to notice, right? And also the impulse here might be to say things like, oh, I liked this or I loved this, which is wonderful. And I encourage you to pair that with why, right? So it's not just, oh, I liked your voice, but oh, I liked your voice because it really captured the sense of your age for me, right? And it really took me back to how old you were. And the reason is because that is replicable, right? I liked your voice is not replicable feedback. But I liked your voice because it did this thing is something that Liz can take and then apply to other parts of the work. Okay, so things that have meaning for you, that touched you, that you can really see, hear, taste. What are a couple of statements of meaning that we might offer to Liz? And you can either unmute and share or raise, I see a hand, or you can also drop them in the chat. Timothy, kick us off.
So I liked how it started very bombastically, like right away. So a very dramatic like entrance almost in a way, which helped me get right into the story. So like almost like we're here now. Like there's no turning back kind of introduction was great, was effective.
Nice. I'm lifting up what Ariel says in the chat. Description of the basement made it feel like I was there. Yeah, I can feel like the cold chair, right? I feel like I'm in every basement I've ever been in and every one of those things. What else? A couple of other examples.
I felt like the addition of the Mandarin story, the presentation that you were going to give, kind of brought us in to be on your team. Like we heard you rehearse, and then there was a sense of anticipation for what the performance was actually going to be.
Yeah, totally. There's a couple other in the chat, right? Like the timing of the speech with the Mandarin language portion allowed me to digest the language, right? The details and the setting of the scene and the why of the presentation. So if we were really doing this, we would probably spend a couple more minutes here in statements of meaning, but I'm going to move us on to the next step. So the second step is what we call questions from the artist. So this is a chance for the artist to ask questions of the listener, right? To help them clarify. Maybe they're trying to accomplish a particular thing. Did that work? And they can be general or specific, but they definitely want to be open-ended, right? So it's not just, hey, did you like that? Which is a relatively closed question. But, I was trying to capture my voice as a 5-year-old. Do you feel like that worked? If so, how? Or whatever it is. So Liz, could you offer us a couple of questions that you might have as an artist?
Yeah, I have a curiosity of how people understood who else was in the room. Did you get a sense, and I'm trying not to say it in a yes or no question. It's like, who else did you was there with me as part of this scene?
Great. So who else was there with Liz, and what sense did we get of the other characters in the space? Folks could either drop answers in the chat or somebody could unmute and speak to that question. Yeah.
I didn't get an immediate, tell me if I'm answering this in a quick fashion, but I didn't get an immediate others are in the room, like, and there was mother or something like, oh, okay. Like it kind of, I was aware of the speaker, I think, in the world that the performer is creating, but not really aware immediately of others that I should be focusing on in the story from that importance.
Right.
Okay.
Great. So this is a good example of like, we can see a couple. So Timothy had one experience, right? And then we can see some other examples in the chat of like, there's other children, maybe there's parents, right? There's other students. teachers, chaperones. There's certainly the person who welcomes everybody, right? But what I would take away from this answer is that there's a little bit of lack of clarity depending on where we were paying attention. And right, and then Liz has a choice to make as an artist about how important is it to her that we're really clear about who else is in the room, right? Like, is that critical part of the story or is it not? Liz, do you have another example question that I'm going to ask you to pose, but we probably won't answer?
Yeah, I guess, do you as an audience have a sense of why this speech is important to me?
Ooh, that's a good one. So like my answer would be, I have a sense that it is important, but I don't know that I know why. I could guess, right? But I don't really know why. So this second portion is this opportunity for the artist, right? And later, and when we do this in the workplace, it will be the person who's receiving the feedback to really kind of drive the conversation, right? What kind of questions am I trying to ask? Where am I trying to like encourage people to share things with me? So the third step is called neutral questions. So neutral questions are questions that are neutral, but we're really trying hard to not embed an opinion or a judgment in it. So as opposed to something like, you know, why did you choose to use Mandarin, right? Where there's both an opinion in my tone, right, and an opinion in the question. I could ask like, hey, Liz, would you talk to me about the choice to incorporate another language in the story? Right? So I have phrased the question in a way that is more neutral. I'll say that in our practice, we tend to, sometimes we will ask these questions, but the artist will not answer them, right? So the artist is like harvesting a bunch of questions that they could choose to answer or not answer. And sometimes it's a question that we're posing and really digging into, right? So I invite folks to think about like, what is a question that you could ask, and then do some revision in your mind to try and phrase it as a neutral question. What's a neutral question that you could ask Liz about the story that she just shared? And again, you can unmute and share, or you could drop it in the chat.
I'll also add that often we use neutral questions to ascertain more information, or I was like information and text. I'm trying to think of the other word that I often use for this from artists as well. Oh, I see them coming in.
So who is your audience? Which to me feels like both like who is your audience in the moment and who is your audience as you are sharing the story, right? The decision to focus on others in the room paramount to the story, which or who is involved in this? Was this your first time in that situation? Are you hopes of getting selected to represent your school? Did you feel confident in your recollection of the experience? Oh yeah, so how confident is Liz in the details of the story that she's actually sharing, right? What do you want folks to take away from this piece? Yeah, these are all excellent neutral questions. And sometimes as an artist, you might get questions where it's like, you know, what was the principal like, and you know, what was their name, and tell me more about that relationship. And Liz as the artist might be like, that is not germane, and just kind of file that question away, right? Or the whole story might be about power and leadership and this particular thing, and so then it is really important that we have that information. So that's one of the many ways that we use neutral questions as an artistic practice. Step 4 is what we call permissioned opinions. So when I talk about this, when I'm in space with people, I'll like take a marker and just throw it at somebody. Usually I have their permission in advance and it's all staged. But this idea of like, if I just toss something at you, it's sometimes hard to catch it, right? Whereas if I'm like, hey, Liz, I'm going to throw this ball to you. Are you ready? And Liz is like, yes. And then we're all ready for the in this case, the opinion to come at us, right? So the permissioned opinions idea is that we say to the artist, hey, I have an opinion about this thing. Would you like to hear it? All right, or may I share it with you? And first, the artist can say yes or no, right? And second, we have to really be thoughtful that we're not embedding the opinion into the request for permission, right? So I'm not saying, hey, Liz, I have an opinion about the fact that I think that you shouldn't speak Mandarin in your story. May I share it with you, right? I might instead say, hey, Liz, I have an opinion about the use of language in your story. May I share it with you, right? So permission opinions can be really tough, right? Because we're trying really hard to figure out, like, how do I give enough information that the person can make an informed decision about whether they are ready or not to hear this opinion, but also not necessarily offer the opinion as a part of it. Would anybody like to try a permissioned opinion? We're probably not going to hear from Liz, but what are things that you might have an opinion about in terms of what she just shared that you could phrase as ask a request for permission? Liz, are there any opinions that you got in your, oh wait, hold on, we got one. I'm wondering about fleshing out the other people in the room. Oh, great, yeah. Can I share that opinion on that with you, right? So I have some thoughts on the other characters in the room. Could I share that with you, right? And then Liz can say like yes or no, right? Because sometimes we're so early in a process that the idea of holding somebody's opinion is just too much, right? Or the piece is so tender, right, that the idea of hearing somebody's opinion is just too much. So this offering of like, hey, I have this thought for you, may I share it with you, is now a good time. Do you have the brain space for it, right? The capacity or the spoons for it. Yeah, I have an opinion about the order of the elements in your story. Great. I have an opinion about the structure, right? I have an opinion about where you begin and end the story. Excellent. Yeah.
I just want to point out that I appreciate how some of these steps are flowing into each other and calling back, right? So some of the neutral questions that came up and some of the opinions are in relation, because we didn't get into it, are in relation to a question that I asked very early on. And that type of conversation can often happen in this artistic process as well.
Yeah. And then the very last step of this process is when we invite the artist, or in this case, the storyteller, to share what they think their next steps are, right? So like, here's what I plan to do next. Here's what I'm thinking about. Here's the couple of notes that I'm really gonna like spend some time with, and that sort of thing. And as Liz just mentioned, like we kind of talk through this in order, but these steps really do flow into each other. And sometimes they'll go a little bit out of order. So we just went through the critical response process, and now I'm going to backtrack. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to actually talk you through the steps again. Okay, hold on a second. I need to share screen. Here we go. Okay, so Liz, you can see that, yes?
Yes. No. Yes, I
Now I
can.
can. Okay, so Liz, Lerman's critical response process. So like we said, the first one is this statements of meaning. So the goal of this step is that like meaning is really at the heart of an artist's work, and starting with meaning is beginning with the like real core of what they're trying to do, right? So here's where the meaning is in your story. And sometimes you might find that the meaning the artist is trying to convey is not the meaning they're hearing from their artist, or from their audience, I mean. And that's really useful information for the artist, right? Like, oh, that's not what I was going for at all. Great. Let me figure out, do I just want to go for that other thing, or do I want to make some adjustments? So what are the responders connecting to? And responders are really thinking about moments that stood out to them, right? So images, turns of phrase, things that are really working. Some tips here are, so we're trying to stay positive generally, but we're avoiding I like or I love without elaboration. We're really trying to stay away from opinions. And this idea of like being specific, like that the cold chairs, like I'm going to be thinking about those cold chairs for a while. It's very small, but very important. Step 2 is questions from the artist. So here the goal is like, what does that person want to know from their audience, right? Like, what are we trying to get after this experience of the work? So the artist is going to ask questions to the responders to clarify their choices. Some tips here, right? They can be general or specific, but open-ended are good. Although sometimes it's just like, hey, did you understand this? Yes, no? Okay, great. And then we spend more time on an open-ended question. Trying to avoid this kind of liked thing, right? Just as that metric is not necessarily really useful. Step 3 was neutral questions. So the goal here is this idea of like, what are the responders still curious about, and how can we share that with curiosity as opposed to judgment? So the responders are asking these kind of neutral or open questions about the work to the artist. Some tips here, right? We are not embedding an opinion. We're trying to avoid questions that cause defensiveness, right? We all know that thing where somebody asks us something and we can just feel our hackles rise. And then this idea that, learning frequently is more rich through discussion as opposed to lecture. And how can we ask questions that encourage reflection? Step 4, permissioned opinions. So thinking about opinions that the responder is thoughtful in their response, is the artist ready to receive it, right? Can they actually hear this opinion right now? So asking that permission, see if the artist is ready to hear the opinion. And some tips there are, asking for permission first. I have an opinion about this thing. Would you like to hear it? Can you hear it? Really honoring the artist's answer, right? They might not be ready to discuss certain parts of the work, no matter how hot we are to share this thing, right? They just might not be ready. And this is also a way to kind of temper critical feedback and share something positive as well. And frequently, it is important that we offer that opinion without giving them a fix, right? Or a solution. It's not, I have an opinion about this thing and here's what I think you should do about it, right? But here's this opinion that I have. And then the artist might say, oh, do you have any solutions for that, right? I'm really coming up with nothing. And the last one is the next steps, right? So the goal here is the artist to articulate their next steps, what they've heard, what they've learned, and how they'll move forward. So that is our critical response experiential process.
Amanda, I actually think you can leave the slides up.
I love slides. 1 second, please.
So, because we're arts educators, right, we might already know this critical response process, but I don't know if we've always thought about applying, CRP to the workplace. And that's what we're here to talk about for the most part today. So I want to just start off by saying that this is not like a one-to-one process, right? CRP for ourselves can be a blueprint or jumping off point for us to utilize the skills and muscles that we develop as part of our creative practices and bring those into our professional lives. And part of the reason I wanted to bring this to Constellation was because I was seeing myself starting to do this naturally with the teaching artists that I worked with as the manager of curriculum education at Second Story. One thing that I want to bring to the forefront is that CRP really needs an object of some sort to focus on. So in artistic practice, it was the story that I told or the dances that Liz Lerman brought or a piece of art. But when we bring it into the professional space, we really want to think about what that object can be. It can be an actual thing like a piece of writing, a design, a project that you or somebody else is working on, but it can also be a behavior or a moment, right? So a deadline, a communication, a habit that you're seeing either from your colleagues or from the folks that you are managing as well. So when we use the term object, that is what we're thinking about, right? It could be a behavior or an actual thing that you're giving feedback on. So looking at our different steps, right? Step 1 for the CRP process is statements of meaning. And what we're really thinking about in the workplace is what worked in this situation, right? This allows the giver and the receiver to create a positive mindset and see how they both view the situation. So what are we noticing about the object or the work? What worked, what was meaningful about the event? There's a lot of ways for us to really structure how we can use statements of meaning in a professional situation, right? We're noticing or putting words to an event or action. Some tips for this is very similar to what we're doing in the artistic practice, right? We are setting ourselves up with positive experiences in this feedback process. And can you click on the next one? Again, we want to avoid stating opinions in this moment, but we also want to be specific, right? Something that somebody said, one of my colleagues said to me recently was they liked how I set up a handout that we we're giving to a client, right? Something that was new to them, but seemed very small to me. And it was really great for me to hear back about that. So examples of this, we might say, I see or I notice things that other people are doing. Okay. So if we move on to our next step, where questions, this time we're calling it questions from the receiver, right? Questions that the person who's receiving the feedback might ask. And really the goal behind this one is to clarify the intent or thinking behind the actions or the choices, right? What does the person who's receiving feedback want to know about the object, whatever they're working on or the event, from their colleagues or their supervisors? Some tips for this one is the receiver can ask a question at any point. I think often we think about feedback as having to happen in a certain time or space, right? There's like a feedback session, but when receivers or even ourselves really feel like they can ask a question at any point, then they have control of this feedback process, right? And then similarly in the artistic practice, questions can be general or specific, but we're trying to make it open-ended. We're trying to really think through that reflection process as part of this feedback process. Okay. Our third way of thinking about applying CRP is neutral questions, right? And in the same thing, the idea of neutral questions in a professional workplace is like, how are we getting to the heart of the matter, right? How are we moving away from defensiveness and towards growth and learning? One of the things that Liz Lerman says in her work is that when defensiveness starts, learning stops, right? So we're really trying to move towards a mindset of growth and learning. So in addition to that, how can we avoid using coded language when asking questions? What are we really trying to say? So feedback givers ask informational or factual questions about the object to the receiver in this instance, right? And forming neutral questions can often be difficult if the goal is to share criticism. And we often find that, especially for figures in positions of power or authority, feel like they have to sacrifice the right to tell the truth directly when they're thinking through neutral questions. However, I find that it forces us, like building our, I see the Tyra's question come up, so I'll come back to that in 1 second. Building in time to develop neutral questions really forces us to slow down and consider what is the object or what is the issue at hand, right? And it also opens up the receiver to the possibility of hearing what the giver really has to say and learning from that moment. So similarly for tips, and tricks, like in the same way for artistic practice, you don't want to embed your question with an opinion or a solution in this process, right? We don't want to avoid questions that cause defensiveness. And the idea is to really open up a discussion rather than a lecture, right? We're trying to encourage reflection. Amanda, you had a great example of coded language when we were prepping for this. Do you mind taking this question that Tyra posed in the chat? Can you give an example of coded language?
I would love to do that, but I'm not remembering the example that I shared. Tyra, I might have to think about this and come back to you, but I think the example that I shared with you, Liz, was around it was more around this idea of embedding an opinion, right? So that idea of, well, I thought that went really well. What did you think, right? Or that sort of piece. But I will think more because you're right. There was a very specific example that now I'm completely blanking on.
We're both blanking on it, and so we'll come back. We'll come back to your question.
Like, well, I think you might have said something like, well, why did you decide to use Chinese or something like that?
Yeah, so that was an example about the actual story. Liz is referring to when we were prepping for this particular section, right? That I had an example about using coded language as a part of the workplace, and I don't remember what it was, but I will come up with it, and it will be brilliant.
Yeah, it's often the thing that we were talking about in the moment, and I can't think about the example exactly, is we often talk around an issue rather than being direct. And so it can often be hard for people to understand what you're really asking when you're like setting up your question if you are trying to talk around an issue. All right, I'm going to move on now, but we will put a pin in that and hopefully remember before we're during break. So our fourth step is permissioned opinions, right? And for the giver, stating that you have an opinion preps you to think about what you are going to say, very much in the artistic practice as well. And as Amanda was saying, for the receiver, it preps them to be able to focus their attention and to hear what the opinion actually is. So the goal for this is to really be thoughtful of how we share opinions and make sure that both all people within the conversation are ready to engage in potentially challenging conversations, right? A lot of the feelings that came up in our bodies often were vulnerability and nervous and their apprehension when we were talking about this in the beginning. So bringing in the step of asking for opinions and being thoughtful before we enter into this conversation really helps minimize some of those physical experiences that we have. Amanda, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to add that in the workplace setting, sometimes offering opinion, it's not would you like to hear it, yes or no? It's, hey, I need to offer this opinion to you, let me know when you're ready, right? It doesn't have to be right now, but sometime in the next whatever day, 2 days, 10 days, at our next meeting, that kind of thing. So that, and it's walking that line between the we need to talk sort of thing, right? But also making sure that if something went drastically wrong and we do need to have this conversation, making sure that we're both in a space where we can really have a conversation about it and it doesn't feel kind of like we are causing harm in a moment when we're trying to actually really problem solve something. So sometimes it's not the would you like to hear it, it's the I have this opinion for you, I'm going to share it with you tomorrow, or let me know when you're ready, or let's carve out some time to actually talk about this, or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can pull up the tips on the screen, one of the things that we were also talking about that is that often we can find ourselves in spaces that we may feel uncomfortable sharing our opinion, right? And it actually can help us prep ourselves and see and test the waters whether or not the other folks at us in the space are open to hearing it as well. So I put in here as an example, right? As a junior employee or a junior staff member, it might be difficult to raise an opinion about something during the meeting or like a staff or board meeting, but starting with I have an opinion opens a gateway to see whether or not this is the time to share it, or you can share it at a different point in time. Similarly, always we want to honor the other person's answers, right, as well. And then I think it's always important that we think about tempering critical feedback by sharing something positive. And then, as we said earlier, to not offer a solution or a fix when we're sharing the opinion, just how we saw it. Now you can go, Amanda. And I think that's the most important step, either in the artistic practice or when you're applying CRP in your work practice as well. It's this idea of closure and next steps, right? So we take the time to summarize what just happened, right? What people shared, and really think about how are we going to move forward. So the goal of this is how can we work to make sure everyone is on the same page moving forward? And really the task of it is either, and this could be anybody who's in part of the conversation, not just the feedback receiver or the giver, can both summarize what they have heard, what they have learned about this process, and potentially, if they're ready, how they'll move forward with their work, depending on what the object or the work or the situation is. Yeah. So there are a few things that I think it's core for us to remember as we're applying CRP in the workplace, right? It is the understanding that, you know, you want the other person to do their best work. And Liz Lerman highlights this in our artistic practice, and I think it works no matter where you are. It's not your best, it's their best, right? I also think that failure is not inherently negative. It's an opportunity for learning and growth, but that doesn't always mean that failure doesn't come with consequences. And you don't have to do these steps in order. So we took out the numbers when we applied to the CRP in the workplace. These are just different tools in your feedback kit. When we go into scenarios, we'll offer these different tools as questions, but don't feel like you need to go in a certain order. Yeah, for example, it may be helpful to start by asking the other person to recount what happened or what's going on from their perspective, which is more of a neutral question, which in the artistic practice is a third step, but might be the first way to start off. And finally, as we said a couple of times, feedback doesn't need to only happen in designated feedback periods, right? Like as tools, you can utilize these at any point in your, career. The one thing I want to mention is as a supervisor, I often use this process with myself. So I want to ask myself the following questions before I engage in any critical conversation, particularly with facilitators or teaching artists, right? So what is my relationship to the other person, right? Where are we in our relationship journey? And especially like who holds power in that situation, right? As a manager of the organization, I often hold power. And so I want to be wary of that when people are bringing issues up to me as well. I also want to think about what is my goal? Like, what is the goal of the conversation? How can we both learn and grow from this moment? Right? I'm not just giving feedback to the other person. I want to be cognizant of what I need to do as well in my position to grow with them. And part of that is who am I centering in this conversation, right? Is it more important for me to get what I need to say out, or is it more important that the person is being cared for and they're put in a space where they feel safe and comfortable and willing to grow and listen? And then finally, are there aspects, and this is one that I've had to learn multiple times, are there aspects of the problem that were in my control that I could have worked on, right? And being really open about that with the folks that I'm working with. So being reflective and using the feedback process is helpful both to your own self as well as building relationships with the folks you're working with. All right. I think that takes us right to a quick break. Am I correct, Amanda? That would be the last lecture part. I meant to say that at the beginning of the section is we're going to go through a short lecture, but I appreciate you hanging in there with me. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break and come back at 2:05. And we're going to invite you, once we're back, to apply some of these tools to different scenarios that you might find in your arts education spaces. So it is 1:59. I'll see you all at 2:05. I will slowly welcome you back into the workshop. I'm seeing some thumbs up come through, which is awesome. I'm seeing some people come back onto their screens. All right. I'm going to throw it over to Amanda, who is going to set us up for our scenario practice.
That's correct. I am going to do that. Okay, so the idea here is to give you all a chance to, in a small group, kind of work through an example scenario and think about how you might use these tools to apply to that particular scenario. So Liz and I came up with 5 scenarios. I'm going to talk you through how this is going to go, and then we'll do a model together as a group before we slide you all into those groups. So we're going to place you in small groups of like 3 to 5. We'll give you a set of slides, and the slide that corresponds to your breakout room number, we'll invite you to dig into that particular scenario. We'll ask you to choose a note taker to capture your thoughts, and then looking at those critical response steps, how might you use those tools to approach this challenge? And really thinking about that, what Liz mentioned right before the break, which is you might not use them in sequence, right? Like you might start with a neutral question and then go into some opinions and then share some things that you noticed, and then, you know, that kind of stuff. So you can really think about what feels the most organic for the situation that you are in. We are not going to discuss yet. So that will be the instructions. Liz is dropping that into the chat, so you'll have that with you as you go through. I'll say that one of the groups will be a silent car. So if you're in a place where you're like, I just need to not talk to people right now, I just want to think about this on my own, just let Ariel know in the chat, and Ariel, who's doing the breakout rooms, will make sure that you end up in the silent car. So you can do some individual work as opposed to working with a small group. We will also drop the CRP steps into the chat, and then they're in the slide deck that you'll have too. So let's do a quick model together first, and then we will pop you into those breakout rooms. So the model here, and I will drop this, so many things in the chat right now. I will drop this in the chat before I read it, but the example is, so you're working with a new school partner, and you want to get some feedback on how the process or the partnership went. So how might you use those critical response tools to get some useful feedback from your partner? So are there particular questions you might ask, or a way that you might try and engage with a new school partner to get some useful feedback for yourself?
So I might offer, I would start with a neutral question of like, how did that go for you?
Yeah, I'm also thinking about the, like, what do we think went well? Why? Where were moments that, what were moments that felt really meaningful to us, right? And then can we dig into that particular moment to figure out why it felt meaningful? Liz?
I'm also thinking about a moment where this has actually happened, right? And our teaching artists were having challenges with their co-teacher in their classroom. So trying to ask neutral questions about where students were when we joined the classroom and what additional support we could have given the teachers in the classroom and teaching artists as well.
Great. So this is just an example, right, of a way, like a scenario that you might dive into. We have given you 5 different scenarios. So we're going to put you into small groups. Again, when you get into that breakout room, there will be like a breakout room number, and that can be the scenario that you all end up in. And then in those slides at the end, Liz also dropped the different CRP. So if you need a refresher, there's a list of the steps in the chat. There's also those slides are in that slide deck, so you can go look at there. But we're going to give you about 15 minutes in this group to read through that scenario and then talk like, okay, how would we approach this? How could we use these different tools? What problems do we see arising, and how might we use one of the tools to help get around that problem? Or other thoughts that you all have about using the critical response tools to apply to this particular scenario. Ariel, you ready with those breakout rooms?
Just about.
Yeah.
Hello. Welcome back. I think, Ariel, just because I'm not looking at it, all the breakout rooms are closed, yeah?
They are.
Awesome. So in a moment, we're going to jump into a discussion about what this process was like, just sort of thinking through it and trying to apply these tools to each of these scenarios. But I'll invite you to head back into that link that we dropped in. And Amanda, can I ask you to drop it in again if it's somehow very far in your chat? And just take a look at some of the notes from other people, right? What were they thinking about in their scenario? So I'm just going to give a few moments for us to like take a look at like what other people wrote in their discussions. Give a shout out to breakout group 4 for going off the slide. Right. As you're finishing our little virtual gallery walk here, and I'm curious, as you were in your pairs or in your small groups, like what did you find successful about these tools when thinking through this scenario? What was successful about this process for you?
I think like getting to the point, I'm sorry, Kristen was on our group chat. Getting to the point, you know, gently, but I'll just throw the like bring the snake into the temple too. We did like talk about like how this is a little bit of a dance sometimes, especially in these classroom scenarios for all in arts ed. Like this has to usually happen extremely quickly. Emails don't get returned or read if it's in writing. Like there are some things that definitely like stop this, I feel like. So we all acknowledge like there's a little bit of a dance to this, like being definitely I don't know, trying to utilizing it to the best of its ability, but realizing it's not perfect, I guess is what we were saying.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
absolutely. I think it's good to have it in the back pocket, but there is also realities that we have to deal with as well, right? Kristen, I wanted to throw it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I find this tool really helpful because it sort of gives you like a multi-pronged approach to dealing with feedback rather than being like giver of feedback, receiver of feedback. It makes things a little bit more reciprocal. It provides strategies to open up the conversation around the feedback as opposed to just being like a one and done, like get it out and say it.
And definitely, I feel like we often think of feedback as like top down in some ways. But I would encourage, if we are teaching artists, right, using these tools as a way to speak up, right, to the folks who are hiring us, like to the organizations as well, as part of this. Timothy got us started. I'm also curious, like, always on the what felt successful train, but also like what felt challenging, right? So the timing, the realistic timings that we have to deal with is definitely one of the challenges. But what were other some challenges coming up for you and your groups? And I missed the comments in the chat.
I think one challenge that ended up being a really great note on our team was just asking the question, like, what is your capacity? And I sort of was like, the option of this person like not continuing the project being an option was sort of like, oh, like that is possibly a solution. That like you just have to consider if that's what they give as like a response. But that question I think can lead to like several other notes from that person.
I did. Everything looks fine. I noticed.
Sorry, I couldn't tell. Was that somebody's talking in your window, or was somebody else trying to say something?
I'm so sorry. We're like double meeting in this space. I don't know if you heard everything, but Demi and Tyra, like, they got that.
No worries. It's the same over here as well. So I also want to drop in, there's a lot of stuff happening in the chat, and just to lift those up as well. I see that Demi wrote that this process allowed me to center the conversation around the result or object and not the person per se. And then I saw that, is it pronounced Ibre?
Abere.
Abere.
Yes, thank you.
This idea of pulling from past and current experiences. Molly wrote, the sentence starter questions to consider were really helpful to ensure that we stayed on task and had productive conversations. I shout out to having productive conversations and not really dancing around an issue. This idea of not being accusatory, figuring out the best way to phrase things with a change in power dynamics, I think is a little bit of what we think about in the arts, right? Is how do we make things more equitable, and really just taking the time to think about it. Demi also dropped in referencing but not allowing past circumstances to color our conversations about the future needs being addressed. And Demi, do you mind talking? Is that something that felt successful or was a challenge that you were lifting up?
No, I felt with using these tools, can you hear me?
We have a hard time hearing you.
Uh-oh. I'm sorry, we're trying to make sure that we're both in one place. Anyways,
yeah.
just trying to make sure that when using these tools, we're making sure not to, again, use the past that oftentimes can color our reaction or the way that we engage with people to get our to get the thing done now. Like I think staying present is super positive, and these tools help me do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So not letting past things color the current conversation. Just want to make, I'm getting it for the recording as well, and staying present. As this really, like, being intentional about tone, about how we phrase things is really coming up in the chat as well. I love what you wrote, keep it in the major key with a nice melody, Timothy. That is a great way of thinking about it. I'm also curious, right? Like, we are, for the most part, artists in our own right, or we're really close to the arts. How do you see yourself already utilizing like this tool or these languages and this techniques in your own workspace and organizations?
So I didn't read all the scenarios, but ours I was like, yes, yes, yes. That's exactly what, like, the day to day. You know, we had our scenario in our breakout was the teacher who didn't pay attention during the lessons and kind of used it to talk and visit. And so that was very, I was like, oh yep, yep. Yeah, you know, so very realistically applicable.
Yeah, I'm also looking at what Carlo just dropped in about a challenge, thinking about a level of subjectivity, right? Like 100%. It's all subjective, right? Feedback is subjective, tone is subjective, the words I use are subjective. I might, like, we were years ago talking about Second Story's values, and we're like, oh, maybe one of our values is hospitality. And we had a couple of folks who had worked like a lot in the hospitality industry, and they were like, oh my God, no, 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 right? So like something that feels totally innocuous to one of us might be incredibly triggering for somebody else, right? So absolutely, a lot of this is really thinking about how can we, with the best intent in mind, right, really spend some time crafting how we are thinking about creating a feedback space, and also acknowledging that that intent might not always land, right? Like the impact might not be what we intend. So thank you for lifting that up, right? That we can do all of that thinking about how we're trying to craft this space, and also still have a misstep. And that's a wonderful place also to use that critical response process, right? Like, I noticed that you're responding in this way. Can I ask you a question about that? Or would you tell me more about what's happening so that I can adjust how this is going, right? It's a wonder way you can kind of just double down with some of that to try and clarify that moment.
I'm seeing like, as a jumping off, Demi also put, as being part of a new team, this is 100% useful in communicating with folks who have unfamiliar working styles. Yeah. Oh. So before we head into our last few moments, like, what are some ways that you would like to implement this more in your work? Or life, as Amanda puts it.
Well, I was telling Liz just yesterday, I have a friend who's in she just lost her father. And it's kind of the first like real major loss in her experience. And so I used a permissioned opinion, like, hey, I was like, I have thoughts about what it feels like to be in that service. Can I share it with you? Right. And being able to, like, when my dad died, there was a kind of how things go in the community that I just didn't know. Like, I didn't expect a couple of things, and I got there and they're like, oh, this is how this always goes. And I was like, oh, that would have been real helpful to know, right? So being able to share with her, like, hey, I would recommend that you talk to somebody who's been through this a couple of times and see if there's those kind of the assumptions, right, that you might want to know walking in. But it really is useful in all sorts of ways. But yeah, that how might we apply these different techniques and tools either in the workplace, in teaching moments, with students, with folks that we are managing or being managed by, etc. Totally. So Kristen, would you unmute and talk a little bit about those two ideas you just shared?
Yeah, absolutely. One of them is that we've been conducting teaching artist observations at Northlight in the same way for a while, and something that we've been wanting to, it's been something we've been sort of wanting to update and make it so that it's more of a chance for like a teaching artist to sort of hone their craft, and also for us to get feedback from them in a more reciprocal way rather than, you know, this is what we observed, and having that be like a one-way street. And my second thing was just, Amanda, what you said reminded me of the kind of practice that I try to integrate of, you know, if a friend is complaining or having a hard day, or if anyone's just looking for support, a form of like permissioned opinion that I generally try to practice in my life, but now I have a great name for it, is asking if, you know, do you want to hear solutions, or do you want to hear comfort, or do you want to hear like, do you want to take your mind off it and talk about something else?
And like, I want to kind of throw in like something here that might be helpful. I've never been asked, but we're readdressing a lot of issues in the arts right now. So, you know, just a question at the end for the artist or the teacher, but I have never, ever, ever been asked in all my years of doing this, did you find pleasure in the work that you did? To the artist, it's always assumed that we are finding pleasure or that we should be very appreciative that we don't have to wait tables, right? So we're doing the artistry, teaching artistry, but like, did you find joy in this, you know, as one of these concluding questions, you know, like, did you find pleasure? And it's not a judgment, like, well, I didn't like that. Okay, whatever. But I think that's really important. And I hope that, you know, I think that going through this today, I'm going to start asking that when I do my observations of peers, and like, are you finding pleasure and joy? The answer might be no. That also is very informative, you know. So.
And that's a great example of, so in other workshops, we talk about convergent or divergent questions, right? Open or closed questions. And the question that you're raising is technically a closed question, right? Did you experience this, yes or no? But it's such a wonderful entry point, right? So if somebody's like, wow, did I? Yes or no? And then like, okay, could you talk about a moment where you, like somebody says, oh yes, great. Like, let's talk about a couple of those moments. What did that look like? How can we build on that? Or no, okay, let's talk about a couple of those moments. What can we learn from, how do we not build on that? Like, how do we anti-build that? But that idea of sometimes those neutral questions might be very close-ended questions, like, did you have this experience or that? And then we can use that identification as a way to follow up, right? And really try and kind of audit, like we can do a little dig into that.
Kristen, I feel like you might have sent something to me that you meant for the group. Do you mind coming off and sharing your thought?
Sure. I was just talking about how this process is similar to critiquing the arts, where we're describing, analyzing. So you're describing the situation, but you're understanding. And so the only thing is we're adding a little bit more SEL, or social emotional learning, to our neutral questions and permission questions, which can also be added into the critiquing process if it's more advanced. Hopefully, it's just really hard, I guess, to have to think in this sort of way. So the more you practice it, like the better the easier it's gonna get, I think, and it applies to all different areas in life.
You took the words straight from my agenda, which was like most things, this is a practice, right? Like we're essentially rethinking and rearranging how our brain works when we give critique. And we're also opening ourselves up to feedback and any sort of practice that takes intention, right? We have to be intentional about it. One of the things that I was going to add that I constantly think about is the fact that when I was first starting to manage facilitators, I was given the note that I don't share a lot of praise. And so as I have grown, hopefully, knock on wood, as a person who oversees, facilitators and contracted workers, I always start with statements of meaning for myself, right? Like I'm thinking about and trying to really notice and see what those teaching artists are doing with their students, what those facilitators are doing in the workshops, so that the first thing that comes out of my mouth anytime I have to give any sort of feedback or critique is something positive. And like it constantly takes practice. Sometimes I'm like, we just got to dive right into what went wrong there. But it is something that I'm trying to be very conscious of.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add there is that so in the CRP and like as designed, that statements of meaning is intended to be positive, right? And also as you're sitting there and what are you noticing? Like, oh, I'm noticing this thing, which I would offer as a critique or I would like to change, right? But you might make a bunch of notes to yourself. I noticed this, I noticed this, I noticed this, I noticed this. And the ones that come out as statements of meaning might be the ones that tend more positive, and the other ones might be the ones that you're trying to build a question around or a permissioned opinion, right? Or even I noticed that you called this student by the wrong name multiple times. Can we brainstorm about how to like what kind of systems or support do you need so that we can help that student feel more seen, right? So that idea, like you can also again, like blending those tools and having the language for yourself around like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer this observation and then I'm going to like move into this space can also be really helpful as we're thinking about kind of intentional spaces for feedback.
I wanted to bring attention to the question that Tyra brought up in the chat was, do you think this framework is helpful for younger elementary students? Timothy, you had a response. Do you mind sharing your thought with the group and then maybe we can think through it?
Yeah, so what my experience has been is that kids aren't going to critique naturally in this way. They're just going to say, I don't like this, that's ugly, whatever. So to get them to this phrasing of here's what I like, here's what I need to know more about, they're probably not going to get the second part. They're not going to understand what that means. But just getting them to do this first part, I found is really, really productive and, the little educational moment. So when we see a piece of art, we watch the kids do a drama. What did you like about what you just saw? Rather than nitpicking or whatever, which is the natural instinct of a child, I think, go after each other. And I've found that to work. The tricky part is the second part, which is the sort of like, here's what I need to know more about or whatever, famous Liz Lerman. They don't know what that means. So, it's can get a little.
I will say that we tend to use this process with high school students, but we have a lot of self-contained students or ELL students in the partnerships that we have. And one of the ways that we have scaffolded for their learning needs is to change some of the language. So for statements of meaning, we don't use the terms meaningful or memorable as part of it, whereas like, what's important to you, right? What do you notice? What do you see? And that helps. And I really think that it can be useful, but always thinking about like, what are the learning needs of the student that you're working with?
Yeah, and I'll offer that I have used this with younger elementary students, and it is 100% about the questions that you're asking, right? So like, was there a moment that you felt sad? Yes. Okay, what was that moment, right? So you're really kind of leading your way through that. Or what are you curious about? Like, what do you want to know more about, right? Is essentially them asking questions, right? And then we can spend some time and you can like one of the things that I'll do sometimes when I'm teaching a critical response process is practice asking really non-neutral questions, right? So like if I'm wearing a scarf, like what are some really mean questions you could ask me about this scarf, right? And then we'll practice asking nice questions, right? Or asking questions that aren't hurtful, right? And I will always use myself, right, for that as opposed to one of the students, because that would be bad. But a lot of it is just about, as Liz is saying, like, how do you simplify? How do you really kind of step by step through what it is that you're trying to aim for? And you might not get all the way to opinions, right? You might just really live in statements of meaning. Like, where did you feel angry? Oh, what did that feel like? Show me that in your face, right? Okay, great. Where was that in the story, or whatever it is?
One of the things that I like to use with younger students is framing it in a plus delta. So like Timothy said, what did you really like about that? And some of you may have noticed this actually in your exit survey, which is my first plug for the exit survey. And then the other question is, what would you change about that? What do you wish was different about that? And that will sometimes still get students saying like, well, I really didn't like blah, blah, blah. But normally I've prepared them in a way that asking me what they would change or what they wish was different will get them to think more critically and less in a place that's like, well, I just didn't like that. Rather than saying, I didn't like that, they will come up with things that are like, I wish this was different because blah, blah, blah.
I want to leave some space for any last thoughts from folks, especially if you've been like holding something. All right. I will offer that one of the greatest benefits that we bring to our educational work as artists is our ability to empathize, as we talked about in the beginning, to challenge others into new ways of thinking and to learn from our experiences. So before we head out, I'm going to invite you to just take a minute and make a note to yourself. Right? What is one small goal or action or question that you want to reflect on coming out of this workshop? What's living in you? We're actually going to take a minute to either write that down for ourselves somewhere. Yes. Raymara, Ariel's going to share the exit survey in a second, but just for yourself, I'm asking folks to think about a goal or an action step or a question that you want to reflect on coming out of this workshop, and Amanda's going to drop it in the chat. So in a moment, I'm going to pass it back over to our lovely Ingenuity folks, but I wanted to thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. It wouldn't be Second Store if we didn't take a moment to give a quick plug. You can check us out at secondstory.com. We actually have our first show of the new year coming up on January 28th. It's called See Change. It's our 25th anniversary, so of being an organization. So we're highlighting a lot of our company members and folks who have been with Second Story for a long time in each of our shows. So I hope you can come out. We are at Haymarket live, but you can also always watch us for free online as well. And if you want to see not that scene, because based on the feedback you gave me today, I'm going to be taking out of it, taking it out of my story. You can see me tell in February as well. If you are more of a podcast person, we also have almost over 200 stories now, Amanda, over 200 stories on our podcast. All right. Thank you so much. I'll pass it over to Ariel.
Thank you very much. And Amanda, do you have those last couple slides? Because we just wanted to let you know about a few things that are upcoming for Ingenuity. So if you are not familiar with Artlook or you just need a refresher, we have our Artlook for Arts Partners session coming up February 6th. That's at 1 p.m. And then some of our next Constellation sessions. The next one is facilitated by Sophia Paget Perez, and it's Synergy in Action, Cultivating Leadership Through Arts and Public School Collaboration. That will be February 23rd from 1 to 3. And Andrew Demura will be talking about from band member to board member, sustaining a culture of student leadership in arts programs. That one is March 21st. And just a note, he will be including one of his students. So that one is a little bit later. It's 3 to 5. And then Tyra, who I think is still in the room here somewhere, her session, Empowering Perspectives, Centering Black Voices in Arts Ed Leadership, is April 18th from 1 to 3 p.m. And you can find all of these things on Ingenuity's events page, which I'll also drop in the chat in just a moment. So we just really want to say thank you all for being here. I have put the link to the exit survey into the chat. And there's also a QR code on the page right here if you want to just scan that with your phone. Your feedback is really, really important to helping our residents improve what they're doing, for helping Ingenuity improve and continue our learning programs for you. And yes, Ray Myra, I see your comment. You're free to register for any upcoming events you like. All of our events are free. So if you pop onto our events page, then you can follow any of the links to find out more about what's going on with Ingenuity. And you can just pop onto right there and scroll towards the bottom. You'll see some of our upcoming events. So thank you again to Liz and Amanda and Second Story for sharing the work that you all did. And we will see you at the next one.
Half empty cup, half-hearted love, half of the time, halfway through crying. But she don't live here by herself, sleeping in the bed she's fake, reading books about sex, working late on Saturdays. That she got some things that go ahead and say, awake, make no mistake, we break down daily with no one. When you're 20 years old.